All right, you guys. So last time we left off on the gluteus medius and minimus. And so the minimus is deep and the medius is superficial, like a soleus and a gastroc, like a brachialis, biceps, brachii. Again, the more deep muscle serves as a fifth class pulley for the muscle on top, have a better angle pull. The gluteus medius and minimus would be not the same, but similar to like the middle deltoid of the shoulder, but it just has some anterior fibers to it. So it would be like a middle anterior delt, just no posterior part. That's why you have the piriformis. I love this picture because it kind of gives you a visual of how the piriformis serves as that posterior kind of deltoid kind of muscle. Because again, even though the joints are similar, they're not the same. There's different, you have to have more mobility up here, down here, you have to have not only more stability, but just more muscles to move our lower extremity, right?
Which one was you saying in that, the anterior fibers?
The gluteus medius and minimus.
All of them?
Pull up your PowerPoint,
Yeah, I got
because, well, look at the description on the top. Gluteus medius and minimus, hip internal rotators, anterior fibers. So we just have to start moving. So when there's answers in this stuff, I just need to point that out so that we can move. We're running very slow. All right, guys. Tensor fasciolata, the TFL. This would be the version of our hip's anterior deltoid. The lower extremities version of an anterior deltoid. The tensor fasciolata, commonly referred to as the TFL, is sometimes referred to as a pocket muscle because it kind of sits where your pocket seam would be, anterolateral. This muscle is common with cross-country runners because it blends into the iliotibial band, that big lateral band of tissue that runs lateral to your leg. The tensor fasciolata, if you look at the functions on the first page of the hip, it's a hip flexor because it sits in the front, it crosses the hip anterior. It's a hip abductor because it crosses the hip lateral. And because it's at an angle, it has an internal rotation pull as well. And again, this is where the basic trigonometry comes. When we're going to see certain angles, you're like, well, that muscle looks very steep. And it's like, yes, but it's at an angle, and therefore the X component is more than you think because of the square nature of angles inside. So let's take a look at the tensor fasciolata. So this would be a lateral, or you know, you can kind of see this would be a posterior view, but you can really see the lateral pull, right? How it would cross the hip laterally, so it would be an abduction pull. And then you can also see from the back the anterior cross, right? How it's crossing the hip in the front because we can see it do so from the back. But this view doesn't really give us a rotation. That's why we want to see it in different ways. This is the good one for a rotation. So again, very steep, but it is at an angle. And so that pull has a horizontal component to its pull. And it's more than you think because of the square nature of trigonometry. So the tensor fasciolata is a hip flexor, hip abductor, hip internal rotator. Those are the functions. So it gets recruited a lot. When we walk, if you remember from 310, like there's constant pelvic girdle influence because of hip motion. And so the tensor fasciolata gets recruited a lot because it pulls in 3 dimensions. What I want to point out from this picture, so this is the iliotibial band, crosses the knee lateral. The purpose of that IT band is for lateral stability more than anything. So when we put lateral, when we change in directions, we need something to prevent what we call varus stress of the knee. And so having that big, thick band, almost kind of like an extra ligament laterally to kind of give us lateral stability as we do side stance. So this view gives us a good showing of the flexion pull. See how it crosses the hip in front? And it gives us a good view of the internal rotation pull, because you can see how even though it's steep, there's a component of it that's pulling in the X. This view gives us a better view of the lateral pull, the abduction. Again, that's why we want to look at them in different views so that we can see the different ways they cross. For hip extension? Not hip extension, because if for it to pull in a direction of hip extension, it would have to cross the hip posterior. For the knee, even though it crosses the knee, it's like on the bilateral axis because it's more stability. So it's like sitting the fence. So it's not anterior or posterior. It's kind of like right on the axis, which again is a good thing for us so that it can create lateral stability. If our knee did move in the frontal plane, it would be like a knee abductor, but our knee doesn't move. So it's there for lateral stability. All right, guys, let's go to the rectus femoris. So the rectus femoris. The rectus femoris crosses the hip anteriorly, so it's going to be a hip flexion puller. Let's see if I can remember this right. Anterior, inferior iliac spine. So anterior, inferior iliac spine to tibial tuberosity. Just tell me how it crosses for now. And again, based off of your graduate studies, it may be important to know these origins for palpation and for other reasons. But for a 400 level applied biomechanics class, we need to know what it does. How does it pull? And we do that by knowing how does it cross. So it crosses the hip anteriorly. Notice not a lateral pull, not a medial pull, just very straight in the front, okay? In addition, the rectus crosses the knee anterior. So you tell me, if it crosses the knee in the front, how is it going to pull at the knee? Yeah, it's going to have an extension pull at the knee. So it's going to be a knee extensor. Hip flexor, knee extensor. We're going to come back. This is your first example of a multi-articular muscle. And we're going to come back to look at these multi-articular muscles because there's some important functional things we could do with them in terms of not only their contribution to things, but their length, making sure we stretch them if we're trying to emphasize the stretch at both ends of their pull. So in other words, if it's a hip flexor knee extensor, not only do we want to extend the hip, but we want to flex the knee. Makes sense? That's why, like when you're doing a hip stretch, when you add the knee flex with it, you feel a lot different stretch at your hip because you're lengthening it at both ends. It's like taking a TheraBand and doing this with it and this with it. Okay, so rectus femoris. Now, you guys are, before I move on, the rectus is one of the quad muscles. The other, the bastide, don't cross the hips, so that's why we haven't gotten to them yet. But the rectus is like the lead singer of the quad. And the reason it has a different name than the others is because the others don't cross the hip, it does. So you got vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius, rectus femoris, that has a different name because it goes all across this. One of my favorites, the sartorius. Sartorius. Longest muscle in the body. It's a long strap-like muscle. You guys are good? I mean, if you have questions, you good? The longest muscle in the body, it starts on the anterior superior iliac spine, crosses the hip anteriorly, and then this is where it does a little, sorry, I got distracted. Where it does a little surprise. It spirals to the knee. It crosses the knee posteriorly. I'll show you some different pictures to show you. So this is a muscle that crosses the hip and the knee, but it looks like it's all in the front. But it actually crosses the knee behind the bilateral axis. So therefore, it's a hip flexor and a knee flexor. The sartorius is very common if you look at it almost kind of creates like an encapsulation. And with people that compete, you can see it really prominently. Kind of like has that long strap-like muscle. This is a good picture because you could show it spiraling around posterior. So the sartorius, hip flexor, crosses right in front. And the knee flexor, I'm going to get to that later. I think this was the first muscle we talked about, the iliopsoas. You have the psoas major and minor, which are anchored on the lumbar vertebra. And they blend in with a muscle called the iliacus, which has an origin on the ilium. Again, sometimes muscles are named based off their origins, their insertions, their functions, Latin words. Soleus is named after a flounder. So to give consistency, that's why we look at their functions, how they pull. The psoas, or the iliopsoas, this hip flexor is very important when we are trying to sprint or run. When we're trying to create fast hip flexion, it has the third-class mechanical advantage of inserting very close to the axis. So a short contraction distance creates a sweeping big range of motion. But think about it, guys. Y'all have heard I pulled a hip flexor. It's kind of like the hips version of core. It can mean a lot of things. You got several muscles there. So just a hip flexor isn't enough. We got to know, well, who are the hip flexors? You don't just have one of them. And again, ironically enough, when you pull the hip flexor, it's because you are extending eccentrics of slowing down extension. Everybody see how this crosses anteriorly? And again, the irony is that if you look at a side view of the iliopsoas, the origin on the spine is actually posterior, and the insertion on the lesser trochanter is posterior, but you cross in the front to go from posterior to posterior. That's why it pulls in front. But if all you did was just see an origin and an insertion, how do you know? The closest distance is back here, right? That's why it's important for us to see where they cross so that we can see how they pull. Pectineus. Pectineus, potato, potato, creatine, creatinine. Pectineus, you tell me, we've done this enough. There's one view, this view should have an obvious pull. The frontal plane pull should be kind of obvious. Muscles only pull, so you just imagine fingers reaching and pull immediately, right? So it'd be an adductor pull, right? It's hard to see the sagittal pull from this view. The sagittal pull would be better if we looked at it from the side, right? Because you can't really tell that the pubis is in front of the femur. So let's look at a lateral view of these. Perfect. Point. See what I mean? So that anterior view shows us a good view of a frontal pole, but we need a side view to show us reflection. And it's a limitation. When you're looking at books and you're looking at muscles, some of these muscles have multiple planes of pull. And not all of those planes of pull would be visible from one view. From that first picture, we really couldn't tell the anterior crossing. Look at that. Can you tell that it has an anterior cross? From this view, you can't tell the medial cross. You can't tell the adduction. So again, that's why we want to look at them in different views to see the different crossings. Gracilis. So y'all familiar with the quad? There are some functions that I'm leaving out, only because they are, let's see how I put it. You have your prime movers, then you have your secondary movers, and then you have like chewy, like some that are so far down the road that like they're insignificant. So if I try to just hold you accountable for the starters and the primary bench players who play. All right, guys, so quads. I know everybody's heard the quads. You have your three vast thigh muscles, and then you have your rectus. Rectus has a different name because I just told you it crosses the hip, the others don't. You have the same concept with our adductor muscles. I pulled a hip flexor, I pulled an adductor. This is where we finally get to muscles that I love because their name has part of their function in it. Hallelujah. So you have these adductor muscles. I'm going to get back to the gracilis, but you have adductor magnus, adduction pull, adductor longus, adductor brevis, apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer, an adductor that only crosses the hip, an adductor that only crosses the hip, an adductor that only crosses the hip, adductor that crosses the hip and beneath. So I can get a different name because it went off and did something at another joint that the others don't. The term brevis and longus is actually a reference to tendon, not muscle. So when we get into the ankle, especially, you'll see like peroneus longus, peroneus brevis. It's a reference to tendon length. So the longus is going to have a longer tendon than brevis, which is going to have a shorter tendon. So you have adductor, brevis, and then longus goes a little bit further, and then magnus, big daddy adduction. This is where we have to keep in mind it's all about direction of pull. Can these adductors do abduction? Absolutely, when they're working eccentrically. But at least these muscles, for the first time, function in their name. I wish they all did. It would make learning these a lot easier. So brevis, longus, magnus, and then the cousin who left town and went off to live in another city, the gracilis. All right, everybody's favorite, gluteus maximus. Quadratus maximus is my youngest son used to call Guys, you notice how this muscle, the gluteus maximus, right? So we have some ilium origin, we have some sacral origin, and pulling on femur. Some of these pictures get a little tricky because you see the muscle kind of go into that IT band, and it kind of looks like it's all blending into the IT band, but the gluteus maximus, which makes sense, is the strongest muscle in your body, right? In terms of lifting and moving you, and there's a reason it's big, relatively speaking. There's no way that that big old muscle can yank on a guitar string. So what we see here is the iliotibial band, and the gluteus maximus actually passes under it to anchor onto the femur. There's some retinaculum and some, there's some fascia that kind of connected, but that's just for proprioception stuff. Make sure all the muscles know where each other's at, proprioception finds them. But this is going under and attaching onto the femur. So look, I could tell you, but I want us to figure it out. We should be the point. Muscles can only pull based off of how it's crossing. How's it pulling? It's crossing in the back, right? Yeah, it's in a big extension pull. Absolutely. Huge. It's also kind of running at an angle, right? So a lateral rotation pull. Now the trick, the femur has this big neck on it that the humerus doesn't have. Okay. So for things to cross laterally, you kind of have to go over this wall. That's the greater trochanter. The gluteus maximus, the way it runs, kind of passes underneath the wall. It doesn't kind of pass over the wall. It kind of passes underneath the wall. So it doesn't have that abduction pull that we think it might have. What I mean by that is this is further out than what the 2D picture is showing us. There's limitations to a two-dimensional flat image. And that's the greater trochanter, that femur, is projecting out. If that makes sense. Okay. So in terms of the pulls of the gluteus maximus, extension pull and lateral rotation pull. That's why like some of those tertiary lateral rotators, they're like, by the time you get piriformis, the obturator internus, obturator externus, gemellus superior, gemellus inferior, quadratus femoris, and the gluteus maximus, that's some horses.
So right now, since this was the extension now instead of having place.
The workout or stretch. Okay, so if it's an extension puller, when we're working out, we need to have something that's trying to flex me, right? So if I was doing straight leg raise, I'd want to be prone, and I want gravity to try to flex me. So therefore, my gluteus maximus can be one of my extensors. And one of the cool things we're going to learn, I'm just giving you the players at the hip, but we're going to apply some really cool things on Monday, which is how do I vary contributors based off of length tension? It's going to make sense, but like why the seated calf raises emphasize the soleus and straight leg emphasizes the gap. We're going to get into those things. I'm going to teach you how if a muscle crosses the hip and the knee, and I stretch it on one end, it's going to pull more on the other. And if I slack it on one end, it's going to pull less on the other. So we'll get into if I flex my knee, that's going to emphasize my gluteus maximus because my hamstring muscles are going to be on slack at the knee, whereas the gluteus maximus isn't affected by the knee position. So it's going to start to get applicably fun when we get into this. Here's another picture of the gluteus maximus. So again, what I like about this picture is you can kind of see that greater trochanter kind of popping out laterally. For it to have a significant abduction pull, it would have to go on top of that. If that makes sense. It kind of have to go on top of that wall. It's almost kind of like a levee, and it doesn't quite get all over the levee. Speaking of hamstrings, does anybody know the names of them? Yes, sir. I'm going to add one caveat. You're batting 99%. The only caveat is biceps femoris, right? Biceps femoris, two-headed muscle in the feet. I have a biceps brachii, two-headed muscle. What's that? No, but I like the way you. The biceps femoris is a long head and short wrist. Only the long head crosses the head. So I'll show that to you. So I love that you do those muscles. Love it. But I'm here to give you that little bit extra, right? That little bit extra. So let's take a look at the biceps femoris first. And notice how that short head stays short. But the long head goes and crosses the hip. Now, all three muscles of your hamstring start on the three muscles of the pelvis, right? Ilium, ischium, and pubis. So your ischium is what they call your sitting bone. That's when you're sitting, you're going to be sitting on your ischial tuberosity back here. So all three muscles of the hamstring start on the ischial tuberosity. But again, only the long head of the biceps brachii actually crosses the hip. So when we say biceps femoris or biceps femoris, that infers both heads. And when we get to the knee, yes. When you have twins, they could do the same thing, but they don't have to do the same thing. So I think that's the one thing I want to emphasize, that when we go into the hamstrings at the hip, membranosus, tendinosis, biceps femoris, long head. So here's a good lateral view. There's the bilateral axis of the hip. There's the posterior crossing of the biceps femoris long head. Here's the posterior crossing. And here's the posterior crossing. I tend, and you may have a different way to learn it. When you look at the hamstrings from together on a posterior view, the membranosus is the most medial. And the reason they call them hamstrings is because back in the medieval days, they would string their pigs because those tendons were so taut and strong, and they would string the pigs up from the hamstrings. So membranosus is the most medial, then tendinosus, and then biceps femoris. So again, if we can get through all the players, I know it's a lot, but that's why we study, that's why we learn. All your functions are listed on the first page of the hip lecture. Your circles are listed if you learn circles. I go through the different pictures individually so that we could see different views as to why they cross the way they cross. Because again, one picture doesn't, especially a picture that has a lot of stuff in it, you can't even see the hip, right? Because it's covered. It's covered with, it's like trying to see inside the present when there's a box and wrapping paper, right? We got to open it up. We got to take pieces out so that we can see what's inside. And then starting next week, we'll start to talk about biarticular muscles and how we can affect their contribution based off of length tension relationships. All right, let's go all the way back to the front. All of your functions are right here. So in other words, if you're a lister, which is perfectly okay, just say, all right, who are my hip flexors? Let's do it right now. We'll make teams and we'll put the muscles in teams. Just remember though, some muscles might be able to play on different intramural teams. Like you could have a muscle who could be a flexor on the flexor team, but also could be on the abductor team and also could be on an internal rotator team. Okay. So let's do it all together. Make sure we're on the same page. And you could use your circles. If you're a circler, just identify them on the circle. But I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Who are my hip flexion pullers? Go slow. What's one of them? What's rectus femoris crosses? These are all the muscles that cross in the front, right? Our anterior crossing muscles. Rectus femoris is one of them. Sartorius, absolutely. Sartorius, rectus femoris. Pectineus, absolutely. Pectineus. It depends on if you want it to sound like a Greek superhero. It's when you go with Pectineus. What other ones? Not the gracilis. Was that? Tensor fasciolata. Yeah. And then there's another one that, there's one more. Yeah. The iliopsoas. Now you're 100% correct. The iliacus is a separate muscle, and the psoas major and minor are separate muscles. I'm trying to make it a little easier because they all blend in into one common tendon, and they all cross the hip the exact same way, insert the same place. So it's common in clinical terms to just call it the iliopsoas. So I'm just trying to make your lives a little easier. So let's check them off. So again, if you do lists, I just want to make sure your list is correct. I want to make sure your list matches up with our circles. You see what I'm doing here? So we need to make sure we have the pectineus, the rectus femoris, the sartorius, the iliopsoas, and the tensor fasciolata as your hip flexors. So again, it's perfectly okay for someone to say, I pulled the hip flexor. But we might need to be able to know, well, which one, because there's different ones that do different things, and we can, so, and we'll talk about that when we get into the applied stuff. Hip extensors. Who's our hip extensors? Semi-membranosus, semi-tendinosus, and then biceps femoris, and you see the little LH? Only the long head. These are just abbreviations because if we try to write in all those long ASS names, it get too overwhelming. But you can abbreviate it however you want. These are just my abbreviations. Okay. Remember, guys, you're not going to find this in the literature. It's a tool to help us identify how muscles pull if you're a visual learner. Okay, who are my lateral pullers, my abductors? Outstanding. Medius and minimus, tensor fasciolata, piriformis. Now remember, this box is sitting on the fence. The box is sitting on the fence. In other words, this one is not lateral, this one is not medial. The whole box is on the anterior posterior axis. Sure. Piriformis crosses lateral. Tensor fasciolata crosses lateral. Gluteus medius and minimus cross lateral. Hey, who are my adduction pullers?
Person.
Good, good. Gracilis, outstanding. And remember, the gracilis is the one in the family that went off and did something else, so you get. Was that? Well, great question. Both of them cross the knee posterior. There's actually, and we'll talk about it when we get into the knee, that's where sometimes this is tough because you have muscles that have function in two different places, but we got to talk about it one at a time. So the knee stuff, I'm putting a pin in it because it all kind of make more sense at the knee. Have you ever heard of an area called the pes anserine? That's where the gracilis sartorius and semitendinosus insert. So they both cross posterior. Is this a right hip or a left hip? Right. Good. So remember, even if I'm doing a left-legged thing, the muscles are the same. We're not like fiddler crabs. The muscles are the same. So even if you do circles, you just say, oh, I need my hip flexors on my left hip. It's the same muscles on the right hip. So you don't have to mirror them and double the learning. You just need to learn one. All right, we did anterior cross, we did posterior cross, we did lateral cross, we did medial cross. Right? Don't forget pectineus in there too, right? So now what we got to do is, go merry-go-round. The easier ones are the medial rotators. TFL, tensor fasciae lateral. And again, we have precedent for this with our pecs, upper pec, anterior deltoid. We have precedent for this. The anterior fibers of our gluteus and medius and minimus have an internal rotation pull. Now, if you wonder, you're like, Campbell, it doesn't seem fair. We have these big, powerful, look at all those lateral rotators. Guys, you do a lot of extension lateral rotation. Can I tell you? Just wait till we get to the shoulder, and I'll show you how the internal rotators are. You got pec, lat, anterior delta. You got some big, powerful internal rotators, and you barely have any lateral rotators. There's a reason for that, because we need a lot of engine to make this go forward, and we'll worry about slowing it down after. We need all hands on deck with one specific speed up function. So there's no law that says these things have to be balanced. It's you're gonna invest where you need it. And we need a lot of external rotation pullers. So internal rotation pullers, tensor fasciae lata. This is where there's outside of a note. I couldn't figure out a way to disseminate because I didn't want to put the same muscle twice. So you're just going to have to put a note that it's just the anterior fibers of the gluteus medius and minimus. They're the only ones. The middles don't have obliquity. The middle ones just run lateral. It's only those anterior fibers that run lateral and internal. The external rotators, the big one, gluteus maximus. But then you have those kind of rotator cuffy muscles on the posterior. That's all the little lateral rotators that are in the circle within the circle. Gemellus superior, gemellus inferior, obturator internus, obturator externus, and quadratus femoris. Now again, the circle within the circle. It's like a bowl, and it's sitting on both ends of the fence. In other words, it's not anterior, posterior, it's not lateral or medial, right in the middle. All it's trying to do is laterally or externally rotate it. So if you are a circle person, you can get a lot of information from here. What's the functions of the tensor fasciae lata? It's a hip flexor, it's a hip abductor, it's a hip internal rotator. How would I stretch it? Well, because it's a hip flexor, I want to extend. Because it's an abductor, I want to adduct. And because it's an internal rotator, I want to external rotate. What's the functions of the gluteus maximus? It's an extensor and it's an external rotator. So if you're a visual learner, there's a lot of information that could come from seeing how the muscles cross spatially relative to the axis of the joints. If you're not a visual learner, that's kidding. That's why I did this for you. I mean, we're getting to the same thing. What's the functions of the tensor fascia lata? Well, let's find the TFL. It's a hip internal rotator, a hip flexor, and a hip abductor. I mean, it's all how you want to learn it. But remember, if there's some that I've said 1,000 times, it's so important. A muscle's function is how it crosses. Origin is important, insertion is important, but not as important as how does it cross. How does it cross the joint is going to determine its function at that joint. Let me identify the multi-articular muscles for when we talk about how we can, because someone had that question in one of the first classes. Will we go into how we can alter the contribution of different muscles, make them work more, make them work less in terms of the group? And the answer is absolutely. That's what we're going to do next class. So the multi-articular muscles, rectus, look, I even put the knee function there. Sartorius, gracilis, and then our hamstrings. Let me ask you this. Your body, guys, your body, you know so much. I just need to get your mind to communicate what your body already knows. You know this. Instinctually, you know this. If you were doing a leg extension machine and you're getting tired, you're getting fatigued, or if you're doing a manual resistance, in other words, something's trying to flex you, you need your extensors. You know, if you're struggling and you're trying to get that extra little bit, your instinct is to lean back. Not if you know what I'm talking about. The reason is because your rectus femoris, which is a hip flexor knee extensor, when you lean back, you lengthen it at the hip. And so therefore it's going to pull more of the knee. Longer is stronger because of the elastic rubber band-like properties of the muscle. The muscle has the contractile little magical Harry Potter things, yes? But it's also made of rubber band, elastic material that's inert, that is only affected by length. When you lengthen the TheraBand, it pulls more. True. When you lengthen the rubber band, it pulls more. True. When you lengthen the rectus, it pulls more. And when you slack the rectus, it pulls less. That's the kind of stuff we're going to get into next week. We'll literally talk about how you can affect why, when you're doing seated knee, your gastrocnemius, big muscle of the calf, is not only a plantar flexor, but it's a knee flexor because it crosses the knee in the back. So when you're doing seated calf raises, it's slacked at the knee. It literally is shorter. There's hardly any stored elastic potential energy there. But when you stand up and you lengthen it at the knee, it's going to have more contribution at the ankle. Or for stretching reasons, we talk about, like, if your knee is extended and your dorsiflex, you stretch out your gastroc. But if you were going to do solely a stretch, when you want to bend your knee, you'd want to flex your knee because you could get further down. You could have more dorsiflexion because you're unlocking the gastroc being the limiting factor. You're slacking it. So therefore, you could go further. No different if my hamstrings are really tight, knowing that they're knee flexors, hip extensors. If my knee is extended, they may stop my flexion because they get tight sooner. But if I unlock my knee, I can go further in the hip flexion. Because now I slack the hamstrings so I can go further. That's what we're going to talk about next week. How multi-articulating muscles can be affected based off of their length and tension. How many of you, I got 2 more minutes, how many of you guys love to stretch? Bless your souls. For me, stretching is torture, absolute diabolical torture. So if I were to stretch my hamstrings and I'm hurting tremendously, I could get that pain away right away just by barely flexing my knees. All of a sudden the pain went away. Because the hamstrings are hip extensor, knee flexors. So as soon as I flex my knees, I get that slap. I think it's stuff you already know, but I'm just trying to make the mechanical connections to what's happening there. So if we were trying to stretch the gluteus maximus, we want to flex the hip. But if we don't flex the knee, my hamstrings may stop my motion before the gluteus maximus gets stretched. Make kind of sense? And those kind of issues weren't found in the trunk and the cervical vertebra, but now they're going to be found in our extremities. All right, guys, y'all have a good weekend.